Thank you, President. And I wish to commence by just talking about a couple of the points that Ms Taylor made. It is remarkable how out of touch government members have become. Now, how can she can say that the government is aiming to keep Victorian people healthy without referencing the hotel quarantine debacle, the second lockdown, and the disastrous way that Victoria has handled the COVID response compared to every other jurisdiction in Australia. And she dismissed the comparisons with New South Wales. But if only Daniel Andrews had done the things, Mr President, that Gladys Berejiklian and the Liberal Nationals government in New South Wales had done. The economy could have been kept open, the population could have been kept safe, the extended lockdown that has had a disastrous impact on so many Victorians, both economically and socially, could have been avoided. And for her to come in and talk about this extension of the state of emergency as if the government has done an amazing job just reflects how out of touch, with the greatest respect, government members are with the feeling on the ground and with what has happened elsewhere within Australia. And her final point was, well, it's very difficult to draft legislation. Therefore, we'd just better rely on the state of emergency. Let's just, as a parliament, outsource to the Premier and the Chief Health Officer decision-making, because drafting legislation is a very complicated business and we might get it wrong. Well, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of dealing with Parliamentary Council now for many, many years, and I think they're very, very capable. They do a great job. They have the capacity to draft any legislation that a member or a government requests. And let's not forget that the government's had a good 12 months now to plan alternative legislation, like exists in other states. New South Wales doesn't operate under a state of emergency. Tasmania doesn't operate under a state of emergency, yet they have the regulations and the powers, when they are needed, to keep their state safe. So Victoria could have developed alternative legislation. And unlike Ms Taylor, I have faith in Parliamentary Council. I have faith in the drafters of legislation to put together government policy or the Parliament's will when it comes to drafting specific legislation. Now, Mr President, it's interesting that I'm not the only one that believes alternative legislation could have been drafted if the government wanted to, as an alternative mechanism. Because as has been reported, some members of the Victorian Bar got together and did just that. Now, the bill they've drafted could be, examined, improved, reflected upon. It may not fit every requirement. It may not do everything that is needed. But the fundamental point is, two or three barristers, two or three members of the Victorian Bar, concerned members of the Victorian Bar, got together and drafted some legislation that could have been considered by government. And as I say, the government has had 12 months to put thought to this as an alternative to an extension of a state of emergency. And going back, Mr President, why does the government need to consider extending the state of emergency in Victoria? It's because they completely botched the COVID response with the hotel quarantine debacle that cost over 800 Victorian lives. So when Ms Taylor talks about the great job that the government's done, when she talks about putting the health of Victorians first, if only they put those words into practice when it comes to hotel quarantine. And isn't it a pity, Mr President, that from the Premier down, everyone the senior government officials who were asked to give evidence to the Coate inquiry, they just couldn't remember. They could remember what they had for lunch 2 years ago. They remember going to the footy 3 years ago and watching, you know, a great game of footy and who kicked the last goal. But who made the decision to use private security? Gosh, Mr. President, I just can't remember. You know, I know that afternoon I did a few other things, and I called this person, I did that. But when it comes to the post-national cabinet meeting, I just can't remember who said what to whom and when, and what we talked about. It's a real pity. It's a real pity, Mr. President, given that over 800 Victorians lost their lives because of that disastrous, mismanaged scheme. And of course, it's clear to Victorians and it's clear to members of this place that now in 2021, we still don't have the contact tracing system up to scratch. Because if we did, we wouldn't have had the 5-day lockdown. The 5-day lockdown that led to a record spike in calls to Lifeline, that sent school children home on the Friday night in tears about the prospect of homeschooling again, that caused thousands of small businesses to lose an enormous amount of trade during a very busy weekend, not least for florists and the like. Because when a similar outbreak occurs in New South Wales, they manage it. The Liberal Nationals government manages it. They put their contact tracing teams into the field, they do what's needed, and they manage it. They keep the economy open, they lock down the necessary areas, but they let the rest of the state remain open. And it's amazing how many constituents have said to me, Mr. President, in recent weeks, what a shock it is going to Sydney and seeing the CBD bustling, a hive of activity. It's got a good feel about it, a dynamic feel. And the same, Mr. President, constituents have been to Brisbane. They say Brisbane's humming along, that it's got a positive vibe. And the sad reality is the Melbourne CBD is like a ghost town and remains thus. And it didn't have to be this way, Mr. President. It didn't have to be this way if the Andrews government had copied other jurisdictions in Australia, had put focus and attention on managing hotel quarantine, had put the investment and time and energy into getting the contact tracing system correct. So we are where we are, Mr. President, because of the mismanagement of the Andrews government. Now, is a state of emergency extension the least restrictive way of managing an ongoing pandemic response at this juncture? And as I say, Mr. President, there are other models within Australia. There are other alternatives that the government could have considered, and they haven't. They've been lazy. They've been lazy. They've failed to consider other alternatives to manage the pandemic response. So here we are with the legislation in front of the House, Mr. President, and then we consider, is there appropriate oversight? Is there appropriate checks and balances? And I know government members have just dismissed the notion of checks and balances, and we have to put our faith, handball decision-making, holus bolus, 100% to the Chief Health Officer. Well, Mr. President, given the consequences and the powers that the state of emergency grants to executive government and the Chief Health Officer, appropriate accountability is the least we can ask for. And the government is basically dismissing that. Mr. Davis has moved amendments to try and increase the transparency and accountability of the use of these extraordinary powers that Daniel Andrews has shown he's all too keen to put into place. And the least we can do, given where we are now in this debate, and given the inflection of time and the failure of the government to consider alternative options, is to agree to appropriate transparency and accountability back to this chamber, back to this House. I, for one, as a member of the Parliament, as an elected member of the Parliament, don't want to just handball responsibility to 3 or 4 members of the executive and say, job done. We put our faith in you 100% regardless of whatever, come what may. We have a job as parliamentarians to review, check and keep accountable those with those powers. So I thank Mr Davis for bringing those important amendments, and the Liberal Nationals will support amendments that seek to increase transparency and accountability of these extraordinary powers. Mr President, if you'd said to Victorians at the start of last year that we'll have a state of emergency and a state of disaster declared concurrently, I think most would have said, not a chance. If you'd said to Victorians early last year that we'd have a state of emergency for virtually all of, or nearly all of, calendar year 2020, and then the government seeking to extend that into all of 2021, I think most people would have dismissed that as just nonsense. States of emergency should be reserved for very limited purposes and limited time. Ultimately, the Parliament should have proper oversight of these extraordinary powers. It should have regular reporting and regular accountability. And unfortunately, Mr President, this bill does not do that. So the opposition cannot support legislation that extends these extraordinary powers for an extended period to the end of this year, with no connection to any outcomes or any known achievable goals. So, Mr President, I congratulate Mr Davis on his amendments, and I look forward to consideration of this bill in the Committee of the Whole.
Thank you.